Tensions between Japan and China are exploding once again, and this time the spark is Taiwan, a flashpoint that has pushed both countries into one of their most dramatic diplomatic showdowns in years. One remark in Tokyo, one furious response in Beijing, and suddenly Asia's two biggest rivals are locked in a verbal firefight. A Japanese Prime Minister hinting at military involvement, a Chinese diplomat issuing threats online, embassies summoned, warnings flying, and a region holding its breath. The latest spat isn't just another chapter in their long, bitter history. It's a dangerous escalation tied directly to the most sensitive issue in the region, Taiwan. And now both sides are pushing harder than ever before. How did a single statement ignite such an explosive standoff? Hello and welcome. You're watching Statecraft with me, Geeta Mohan. The chain reaction began when a Japanese lawmaker asked Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi what kind of Chinese action against Taiwan could trigger Japan's right to collective self-defense. Her answer? Battleships, force, and anything resembling an attack could qualify as a survival-threatening situation under Japan's 2015 security law, meaning Japan could send troops. Beijing exploded, calling her remarks egregious, dangerous, and gross interference. A Chinese consul general even posted a violent threat online. Protests flew in both directions, military warnings followed, and the question now is, how far will each side go before this diplomatic war becomes something far more serious? It all started in the Japanese parliament last Friday, when a simple question ignited a geopolitical storm. An opposition lawmaker asked Takaichi to define what, in the context of Taiwan, would count as a survival-threatening situation for Japan. Her answer was blunt, direct, and instantly controversial. If China uses battleships, if China uses force, if China launches any military operation around Taiwan, Japan could consider its own national survival at risk. Under Japan's 2015 security law, such a situation opens the door for collective self-defense, meaning Japan's self-defense forces could enter the conflict. In Asia's fragile security environment, that one statement ricocheted like a warning shot. China wasted no time. Beijing's foreign ministry described her comments as egregious, a word loaded with diplomatic venom. But it didn't stop there. The next day, Xue Jian, China's consul general in Osaka, reshared news of her remarks with a chilling comment, and I quote, "The dirty head that sticks itself in must be cut off." Those words were immediately recognized as explosive. Japan's chief cabinet secretary Minoru Kihara called the comment highly inappropriate. Tokyo filed a strong protest. Beijing filed one back. A digital threat had just detonated into a full-blown diplomatic clash, and the fallout was spreading fast. Xu later deleted his post, but the deletion didn't erase the damage. Japan demanded accountability. China demanded a retraction from Takaichi. Instead, she stood her ground. She refused to retract anything, insisting her words were consistent with the government's traditional position. That line alone signaled something bigger. Japan was not backing down. But she did add one caveat. Going forward, she would be careful about describing specific scenarios. That slight concession wasn't enough for Beijing, which responded with even harsher warnings. China declared Japan was playing with fire, a phrase Beijing usually reserves for the Taiwan independence movement. Then came Thursday. China's foreign ministry posted again, this time in Japanese and English, issuing another warning. If Japan dares to meddle in the cross-strait situation, it would be considered an act of aggression.
Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi recently made provocative remarks about Taiwan in parliament, suggesting the possibility of armed intervention in the Taiwan Strait after China lodged solemn representations and strong protests. She remained obstinate and refused to retract these erroneous statements and actions. This seriously violates the One China principle, seriously violates the spirit of the four political documents between China and Japan, and gravely contravenes the basic norms governing international relations, constitutes a blatant interference in China's internal affairs, challenges China's core interests, and infringes on China's sovereignty. China firmly opposes this and will not tolerate it. Japan must immediately correct its mistakes and retract these egregious remarks. Otherwise, all consequences must be borne by the Japanese side. If Japan dares to intervene militarily in the Taiwan Strait, it would constitute an act of aggression, and China will respond with resolute countermeasures. China will firmly exercise its right to self-defense under the UN Charter and international law, and will resolutely safeguard national sovereignty and territorial integrity. We strongly urge Japan to deeply reflect on its historical crimes, immediately stop interfering in China's internal affairs and provoking with wrong words and actions that cross the line, and refrain from playing with fire on the Taiwan question. Those who play with fire will only get burned.
This wasn't subtle diplomacy, this was open intimidation. On the same day, Chinese Vice Foreign Minister Sun Weidong summoned Japan's ambassador for what state media described as serious démarches. Sun called Takaichi's comments extremely wrong and dangerous. He demanded Japan withdraw them entirely. And then he delivered China's most chilling line: if Japan doesn't, all consequences must be borne by Japan. Japan's ambassador pushed back. He explained that Japan's position has not changed. He emphasized that Japan still supports peaceful dialogue, but he also refuted Beijing's accusations. At the next press briefing, Kihara reiterated that Japan follows the One China principle as outlined in the 1972 joint communique. Yet, he also repeated that Japan strongly urged China to take appropriate action, especially regarding Xue's threatening post.
On the subject of the protest lodged by China yesterday against Prime Minister Takaichi's speech in the Diet, in response, we again provided China with a rebuttal and explanation of the intent behind Prime Minister Takaichi's remarks and the position of the Japanese government. Regarding the recent post by the Chinese Consul General in Osaka as an official statement from a Chinese diplomatic mission, it is highly inappropriate, and we have lodged a strong protest and once again urge the Chinese side to take appropriate action. Peace and security in the Taiwan Strait is vital for Japan's security, but also for the stability of the international community. The government of Japan has consistently maintained the position that we expect issues concerning Taiwan to be resolved through peaceful dialogue. The government's position on Taiwan remains unchanged from the 1972 Japan-China Joint Statement. As for China's part, we continue to strongly urge them to respond appropriately.
Japan had drawn its own lines, China had drawn its own, and both lines were getting closer to collision. At the heart of this crisis lies a long, painful, and complicated history. Japan's 19th century wars, Japan's World War II campaign in China, and the deep scars that remain have shaped every diplomatic exchange since. China's foreign ministry invoked this history directly. In its statement, China warned that if Japan fails to draw lessons from history and decides to take reckless risks, especially military ones involving Taiwan, Japan would suffer heavy losses against the iron wall of the Chinese People's Liberation Army. In other words, China reminded Japan of past wars and threatened future ones. But this clash isn't just about history, it's about leadership. Takaichi, a political protege of the late Shinzo Abe, brings a more assertive approach to national security. She advocates closer ties with the US, higher defense spending, and a tougher stance against China's regional expansion. She has long supported Taiwan. She has previously said a Chinese blockade of the island could threaten Japan. She has also said Japan could mobilize troops to stop a Chinese invasion. Beijing knows all of this, and Beijing doesn't like any of it. China's sensitivity toward Taiwan cannot be overstated. To China, Taiwan is not a debate, not a question, not an argument. It is an inseparable part of its territory. Beijing has never ruled out using force to achieve unification. For years, China has conducted military drills around the island, launched balloons, flown sorties into Taiwan's Air Defense Identification Zone, that is ADIZ, and sent ships close to its shores. China frames all of it as internal affairs. So when a Japanese prime minister even hints at possible intervention, Beijing sees it as crossing a red line, violating the One China principle and encouraging Taiwan independence. China had already been irritated earlier this month when Takaichi met a senior Taiwanese official at the APEC summit in South Korea. Beijing accused her of violating the One China principle before this entire controversy erupted. So by the time she made her parliamentary remarks, China was already on edge. Her new remarks, in Beijing's view, were exactly the kind of wrong signal China fears. It triggered China's most familiar accusation: Japan was interfering in China's internal affairs. Foreign Ministry spokesperson of China, Xue Jian, repeatedly reminded the world Taiwan is China's Taiwan.
Anyone who has wishful thinking about challenging China's bottom line will inevitably suffer against China's resolute countermeasures and will inevitably suffer a crushing defeat in front of the 1.4 billion Chinese people who have built with their flesh and blood a formidable steel wall. Any force that dares to obstruct China's great cause of reunification is deluding themselves like a mantis trying to stop a chariot, and is destined to fail. China is deeply concerned and requests that Japan take the matter seriously, conduct thorough investigations, and contain such behavior. We once again urge Japan to face up to the root cause of the issue, immediately correct and retract the egregious statements and actions. Stop confusing right and wrong, stop shifting blame, and stop making unfounded counter-accusations. China is seriously concerned over recent trends with Japan's military. Japan claims to be a peace-loving nation and publicly advocates a world free of nuclear weapons. Yet the Takaichi administration has been ambiguous and evasive on the three non-nuclear principles, even hinting at the possibility of abandoning them.
Lin also asked the question Beijing asks every time another country expresses support for Taiwan. What signal is the Japanese leader trying to send to Taiwan independence, separatist forces? To China, any statement that acknowledges Taiwan's vulnerability or implies support in a conflict is automatically categorized as separatist encouragement. That framing allows Beijing to escalate diplomatically, militarily, or rhetorically. In this case, China used all three at once. There's also the US factor, though neither side said it aloud in these statements. Japan's stance resembles American-style strategic ambiguity, staying vague enough about intervention to keep Beijing guessing. For decades, this ambiguity has acted as a deterrent, preventing China from assuming foreign militaries would stay out of Taiwan's defense. Tokyo has historically avoided discussing Taiwan publicly, but when Japan does speak, China always responds sharply. In 2021, when Taro Aso said Japan would defend Taiwan alongside the US, Beijing erupted with the same anger it's expressing today. This is not an isolated diplomatic flare-up. It is a continuation of China's heightened military pressure on Taiwan. From 2022 onward, China expanded its air and maritime operations, including live-fire drills simulating blockades. Taiwan labeled China a hostile foreign force. Japan watched closely. The US maintained ambiguity, and China continued pushing the boundaries. Now in 2025, the tensions reached a new point. When Takaichi spoke in parliament, she did so against the backdrop of Chinese jets entering Taiwan's ADIZ almost daily and Chinese naval vessels expanding their patrols. Japan has increasingly viewed Taiwan's security as intertwined with its own. The geographic proximity is undeniable. A Chinese attack on Taiwan would shift power balances in the entire maritime region, and Taiwan sits directly in the first island chain, a line of islands Japan depends on for its own security. So when Takaichi said Japan could consider a Chinese attack as a survival-threatening situation, she expressed what many in Japan's defense establishment already believe. This belief, however, is exactly what China considers provocative, dangerous, and unacceptable. This crisis also exposes long-standing military tensions between the two nations. Chinese aircraft have flown dangerously close to Japanese reconnaissance planes. Chinese naval maneuvers near Japanese waters have raised alarms in Tokyo. Japan accuses China of unsafe behavior. China accuses Japan of interference. Every one of these incidents adds to rising mistrust. Every one becomes a data point in a larger story. Japan and China, two historical rivals, moving closer to confrontation over Taiwan. The warnings from China grew sharper by the day. On 13th of November 2025, Chinese state media and military officials warned that Japan would suffer a crushing defeat if it intervened. That language is not accidental. It's designed to intimidate, to deter, and to remind Japan of China's growing military power. It's also a reflection of Beijing's internal politics, where appearing soft on Japan or Taiwan is politically impossible, so the rhetoric escalates, and the region grows tenser. Japan responded in its own way. Kihara repeatedly reminded reporters that Japan hopes for peaceful dialogue. Japan reaffirmed the 1972 communique. Japan clarified that its position had not changed. But Tokyo also protested strongly against China's threatening language. And most significantly, it did not disavow or retract Takaichi's remarks. That is the part Beijing cannot ignore, because it signals something deeper, a shift in Tokyo's tone, posture, and willingness to openly challenge China over Taiwan. The last 48 hours were a microcosm of a much bigger pattern. Japan's Prime Minister articulated a scenario under which Japan would defend Taiwan. China condemned it. A Chinese diplomat made a violent threat. Japan protested. China escalated. Military warnings were issued. Embassies were summoned. Statements were exchanged. And both sides dug in deeper. Taiwan, once a distant issue for Japan's public, has become a national security priority. China, once more cautious about Japan, has become more confrontational, and this cycle shows no sign of slowing. China's final warnings were blunt. The foreign ministry said Takaichi's remarks were gross interference. Xue Jian said Japan must immediately stop. Sun Weidong demanded a retraction. China warned of firm countermeasures. Japan, meanwhile, held its line: dialogue, peace, stability, and adherence to the communique, but with a new edge, acknowledging Taiwan's direct link to Japan's survival. That subtle but powerful shift is what triggered this entire storm. In the end, this is about more than one statement. It's about historical wounds, military tensions, Taiwan's future, regional power balance, and the rising assertiveness of both governments. China insists on reunification. Japan insists on security. Taiwan sits in the middle, becoming the central flashpoint for the biggest rivalry in East Asia. And with every warning issued, every diplomat summoned, every statement sharpened, the region inches closer to a point where words may no longer be enough to contain the conflict. Thank you for watching Statecraft.